They marched me out as if I were a malfunctioning exhibit, something dragged from storage to prove a point. The floor beneath my boots hummed with restrained energy, each step answered by a ripple of light that seemed far too expensive to be wasted on my impending death. Above, the air shimmered with hovering constructs, observers, weapons, translators, all whispering to one another in languages that had too many consonants and not enough mercy. I waved at them anyway. If you're going to die, you might as well be polite. Across the vast curve of the arena, the Empress reclined on a structure that pretended not to be a throne. Her gaze landed on me briefly, then slid away, already bored. I understood that look. I'd seen it on officers watching new recruits trip over their own rifles. Somewhere near her stood a woman who drew my attention without trying. She looked human at a distance, almost disarmingly so, until her long ears curved back in elegant lines, catching the light as they shifted with every subtle change in her expression. She studied me like a puzzle that had insulted her intelligence by existing. A voice boomed inside my skull, translated just politely enough not to cause bleeding. The terms were explained. I was to survive as long as I could. They would stop when I stopped moving. Very clear, very fair, very generous. I cleared my throat and asked if there was a prize for exceeding expectations. The pause that followed was deeply satisfying. When the first wave came, it came fast and loud, because alien militaries apparently believed volume was a substitute for inevitability. Energy bolts scorched the air, shaving past me close enough to warm my cheek. I dove, rolled, came up behind a fragment of arena plating that hadn't been designed for this kind of stress. It screamed as much as I did. I laughed, a sharp sound that surprised even me, and shouted something about their aim being compensatory. The army reacted like a single offended organism. Targeting grids adjusted, gravity fluctuated just enough to make every step feel like a bad dream. I compensated the only way I knew how, by refusing to play along. I sprinted when they expected me to crawl, crawled when they tried to pin me down, and tossed a compact charge into a hovering drone simply because it annoyed me. The explosion echoed, and I gave an exaggerated bow to the Empress's distant silhouette. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement on the viewing platform. The long-eared woman leaned forward, one hand lifting as if she'd forgotten it wasn't her turn to speak. Her ears twitched, a small, betraying gesture, and I wondered briefly what it meant in her culture. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief, or the realization that the human wasn't following the script. Minutes stretched in ways minutes weren't supposed to. My lungs burned, my hands shook, and my jokes got worse, which I took as a sign of progress. When a mechanical hunter misjudged a jump and slammed into the arena wall, I told it not to feel bad, that I'd had worse landings. The translator helpfully rendered this into something that caused several officers to glance at one another, confused and offended. Between volleys, I dared another look toward the platform. The Empress was watching now, truly watching, her posture rigid with something that might have been irritation. The royal woman beside her had turned fully toward the arena, long ears angled forward, eyes sharp and searching. For a moment our gazes met. I grinned at her because it felt important not to look afraid. She didn't smile back, but her ears flicked again, and that felt like a small victory. The arena systems began to strain, lights dimming and flaring as if unsure whose side they were on. I leaned against a pillar that hadn't yet given up on existence and muttered a thank you to it. Somewhere above, calculations were being rewritten in real time, probabilities stretched thin. I was still alive, against all professional expectations, and the silence creeping through the army felt heavier than the weapons. I straightened, wiped blood from my lip, and raised my voice. "Is this the warm-up?" I asked, "or should I stretch?" The question hung there, ridiculous and defiant, and for the first time since I'd been dragged into the light, the outcome felt uncertain enough to be interesting. They answered my question with more firepower, which I took as confirmation that stretching would have been wise. The arena shifted beneath me, panels reconfiguring as if the ground itself had decided I was a bad guest. Gravity hiccuped, pulled left, then down, then briefly nowhere at all. I floated for half a second, long enough to think about how embarrassing it would be to die flailing, then slammed back into the floor hard enough to rattle my teeth. I spat, checked that everything important was still attached, and muttered that I'd be leaving a review. New machines entered the field, sleeker than the first wave, their movements smooth in a way that suggested overconfidence. They coordinated instantly, herding me toward a narrowing corridor of light. Someone up there had decided chaos wasn't working and opted for control. I ruined that by throwing myself sideways through a flickering energy seam that hadn't quite finished calibrating. It felt like diving through cold fire. On the other side, I came up laughing and shouted, "You should really put up a sign." The army adjusted again. They always did. What they didn't adjust for was stubbornness layered with spite. I scavenged as I moved, ripping loose a fallen drone's power cell and jamming it into my own battered gear. The interface screamed in protest, alarms cascading through my visor. I told it to relax. It didn't listen, but it worked anyway. Between bursts of motion, I became uncomfortably aware of the attention. Not the general kind, the massed, judgmental silence of an army, but a focused awareness, like being watched by someone who was no longer sure what they were seeing. I glanced up. The Empress's gaze was sharp now, her boredom burned away into something cold and precise. Beside her, the long-eared woman stood rigid, hands clasped too tightly. Her ears angled and re-angled, tracking the fight, tracking me. When I tripped a gravity snare and barely kept my feet, she inhaled sharply as if she'd felt it herself. That almost threw me. I recovered by nearly getting vaporized instead. A beam carved a molten line inches from my leg. I yelped something unheroic and dove behind a collapsing barrier. "Okay," I said to no one in particular, "now you're just being rude." I popped back up long enough to lob a pulse grenade into the cluster, advancing on my position. The resulting electromagnetic tantrum sent 3 units spinning into one another like drunks leaving a bar. I saluted them. The translator must have been working overtime because a ripple of sound moved through the ranks. Confusion, disbelief, something dangerously close to laughter. That seemed to annoy the command algorithms. The arena darkened, light sources snapping off until only threat markers glowed. My visor painted the world in hostile colors. My heart hammered. I cracked a joke about mood lighting to keep it company. Time stretched again, elastic and cruel. I moved by instinct, by memory, by the simple refusal to stop. My muscles screamed, my lungs felt lined with glass, but every time I expected the killing blow, it didn't come. I began to suspect they wanted me alive now, at least long enough to understand me. That thought was almost flattering. I risked another look upward during a brief lull. The long-eared woman had stepped closer to the edge of the platform, her composure fractured just enough to show something underneath. Curiosity, maybe. Concern. Her eyes met mine again, and this time I didn't grin. I just nodded, a small, human gesture that said, "I'm still here." Her ears stilled, perfectly straight, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The arena shuddered as a new directive rolled through its systems. Heavier units deployed, their shadows stretching across the floor. I exhaled slowly and rolled my shoulders. "All right," I said to them, to myself, to the woman watching. "Let's see what you've got." The first impact drove me to one knee. I stayed there a moment longer than necessary just to make a point, then forced myself back up, laughing breathlessly. Somewhere above, certainty was cracking. I could feel it in the pauses, in the recalculations, in the way the silence no longer felt absolute. I was still alone, still outmatched, still very much not dead, and that apparently was becoming a problem. They came at me with everything they had left, which I appreciated in a strange way. It felt honest. The heavier units closed in, their steps synchronized, their weapons humming with energies my suit politely labeled as catastrophic. I raised my hands for a second, palms out, and said, "Before we continue, I'd like to formally complain about the service." No one laughed out loud, but the timing of the next volley faltered just enough for me to move. I didn't move fast. That part surprised me. Somewhere between the first impossible minute and the last impossible hour, panic had burned itself out. What was left was focus, sharp and quiet. I slid, ducked, redirected force instead of meeting it, letting the arena's wounded systems do half the work for me. Gravity flickered again, weaker now, exhausted like the rest of us. I used it, pushing off at angles that would have snapped me in half earlier, landing badly but landing alive. A blast finally caught me full on and threw me across the floor. I skidded, rolled, and stopped staring up at a sky full of alien machines and one very intent balcony. My body protested in a long, detailed report. I acknowledged it and stood anyway, slower this time. When I wiped my face, my hand came away red. "Yeah," I told myself, "that tracks." The silence was wrong. No immediate follow-up, no correction. I looked up. The Empress had risen. She stepped forward, one hand raised, and the army froze so perfectly it felt like the universe itself had paused. Her voice didn't boom this time. It slipped into my head like a blade into water, controlled and cold. This was no longer a demonstration. This was an inquiry. I straightened as much as I could manage. "If this is where you ask me to surrender," I said aloud, "I should warn you I'm terrible at it." A ripple passed through the observers. The long-eared woman stood beside the Empress now, no longer half-hidden, her posture unmistakably defiant. Her ears were forward, unwavering. When she spoke, her voice joined the Empress's channel without permission, and no one stopped her. She didn't speak to me at first. She spoke about me, about humans, about error margins and assumptions and the difference between weakness and restraint. Each word landed like a recalibrated weapon. The Empress listened. That more than anything told me the fight was over. I sagged, letting myself sit before gravity or pride could argue. The arena lights brightened incrementally, systems powering down with exhausted sighs. Medical drones hovered closer, uncertain, like animals approaching something that had bitten them earlier. I waved one away. "Give me a minute," I said. I earned it. When the Empress addressed me again, there was something new in her tone. Not warmth, not kindness, recognition. She asked why I had fought so hard when survival was statistically absurd. I thought about it, really thought about it, and then shrugged. "Because you expected me not to," I said. "And because someone was watching." The long-eared woman met my eyes. This time she smiled. It was small, controlled, and entirely genuine. Her ears relaxed just a fraction. I realized then that I wasn't standing alone anymore, not really. Something had shifted, not just for me but for them. They didn't chain me. They didn't cheer either. They offered terms carefully worded, layered with politics and possibility. An end